Welcome back, drifters. Today, I bring you the most mysterious tale in all of Greek mythology. Countless theories and stories have tried to unravel the secrets of this city, but tonight, you'll hear the most authentic version, drawn directly from ancient texts and retold as a suspenseful, immersive story crafted for your journey into sleep. If you enjoy drifting through forgotten myths and ancient wonder, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us guide you into the next dream. Atlantis was a legendary island realm that lay far to the west, beyond the known lands, and it was said that this great land, full of wealth and power, was sunk beneath the ocean by the gods as punishment for the people's growing pride and moral decay. The island, larger than both Libya and Asia combined, had once been home to a mighty empire that reached out its influence not only across its own lands, but also to other nearby islands and parts of the great continent, beyond the Atlantic Ocean. The Greeks often used the term Atlanteans for peoples living along the Barbary coast of North Africa, near the Atlas Mountains, and the historian Diodorus Siculus described their mythologies involving titans and fierce wars with the Libyan Amazons. It is possible that these groups were connected in some way to the stories of Atlantis, especially since the second Atlantean king mentioned by Plato, named Gadeiros, bears the same name as a well-known Phoenician colony close to the Straits of Gibraltar. Other ancient writers suggested similar places, such as the southern island of Pangaea and the bright islands of the Heliades, but none captured the imagination quite like Atlantis. According to the account preserved by Plato in his dialogue Timaeus, the story had been passed down from the Egyptian priests, who told of a time when a mighty power rose from the Atlantic and set out on a great conquest against the lands of Europe and Asia. This force came from a land beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a place where the sea was once wide and navigable, and from that island it was possible to reach other lands and even the great boundless continent beyond. The sea inside the pillars was considered only a small harbour in comparison to the true ocean outside. On this enormous island of Atlantis, a powerful empire ruled with strength and wealth, having dominion not only over its own land, but also over many other islands and parts of the surrounding continent. This empire extended its control into Libya, as far as Egypt and into Europe, as far as the region known as Tyrrhenia in Italy. Their strength and ambition were vast, and they united their forces with the aim of conquering all lands within the straits. But at this time, the city of Athens, noble and virtuous, stood as the defender of freedom and justice. Though the threat was great, and most others either submitted or fell away, Athens alone rose in resistance, displaying exceptional bravery, wisdom, and military skill. This city led the fight, standing firm against the invaders from Atlantis, and through great struggle and suffering it prevailed. The defenders of Athens overcame the mighty force from the west, preventing their domination and freeing those who were threatened by their rule. In the moment of triumph, however, the world shifted. Violent earthquakes and floods shook the earth and sea. In one single night and day of great disaster, both the warriors of Athens and the island of Atlantis were lost. The ground opened, the waters surged, and Atlantis was swallowed by the ocean, vanishing from sight forever. The once proud empire disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only the memory of its power and the warning of its fate. The sea where it once stood became impassable, filled with mud and debris, making travel and discovery impossible. The tale, preserved through the words of ancient philosophers and remembered by generations, stood as a reminder of what could come to those who reached too far, who forgot the balance of power and virtue, and who ignored the natural order set by the gods. The island that had once connected to other far-off lands, that had ruled with glory and might had become nothing more than legend, a sunken memory beneath the ocean's surface, where no ship could sail and no diver could reach, lost to the world yet always remembered in the quiet stories of old. In like manner, the island vanished into the depths of the sea, swallowed completely by the waters in a sudden and terrible event, and from that day forward, the sea in that region became impassable and blocked by a thick shoal of mud, a remnant left behind by the collapse of the land, making the passage to the true ocean beyond impossible for those who set sail from the inner sea. The vast island that had once ruled over so many lands was no more, its great towers, temples, and cities hidden beneath layers of water and earth, leaving behind only silence and silt. It was this disaster that created a lasting obstacle in the form of thick, impenetrable mud that choked the straits and turned a once navigable route into a forbidden zone. In another account preserved in the writings of the philosopher, the tale continues through the voice of a wise speaker who claimed that if he could recall well enough the story once told by the priests of Egypt and passed down through Solon, then he would be able to share it with accuracy, fulfilling the task of memory and narration for the gathered audience. He began at once, delaying no further, for he had to recount a story that stretched back 9,000 years from his own time, a story of a war between the people who lived beyond the Great Pillars and those who lived within them. On one side of the conflict stood the proud city, ancient and noble, which took up arms to defend itself and its allies, fighting with all its might throughout the entire duration of the war. On the other side were the kings of the powerful island, the same island that had once been larger than both Libya and Asia, but now lay beneath the waves, broken by quakes and reduced to a memory that had left behind only mud and wreckage, preventing travelers from reaching the wide sea beyond. The tale, as it unfolded, would reveal many things about the peoples of that time, about the scattered tribes and nations of the old world, both the so-called barbarians and the Hellenes, and would lay out what became of them during the unfolding of that great war. But before all that could be told, the story had to begin with the two leading powers, those who stood first in the fight, and it was only proper to begin with the ancient city to understand its strength, its leadership, and its way of life. In the time long before memory, the gods, having dominion over the world, divided the lands among themselves, not through fighting or contest, for such strife would not be fitting for beings who knew the limits of their own rights and the rightful claims of others. Instead, by orderly division, each god took a part, receiving, by fair allotment, a domain to rule. Once they had claimed and settled their own regions, they began to nurture the people within them, not by force or compulsion, as shepherds do with rods or whips, but by steering the souls of men with gentle persuasion, guiding them inwardly like one might guide a vessel, with a rudder from the stern. In this way, the gods shaped their people according to their own divine nature, leading them not by oppressing their bodies, but by speaking to their spirits, nurturing them, instructing them, and drawing them to live as they were meant to live. And so, guided in this manner, humankind was raised up under the divine care of those who ruled from the unseen. These gods, having settled in their lands and taken responsibility for the mortals under their charge, established order and planted the roots of civilization, each according to their wisdom. The people thrived under their care, and the cities grew in beauty and strength. Among these, the old city stood out, full of virtue and wisdom, strong in battle and just in peace. And it was this city that would come to oppose the mighty forces from the sunken island. The kings of that distant island had amassed great power, ruling over vast lands, many islands, and distant parts of the continent. But though they were strong in numbers and wealth, and though their forces were large and well prepared, it was not enough to overcome the courage and unity of those who stood within the straits. The defenders fought bravely, not for conquest, but to preserve freedom and to protect the lands from falling into foreign hands. As the tale tells, in the days that followed, disasters struck with force and fury. Tremendous earthquakes shook the earth and the sea rose up in waves. The people of the island, who once stood tall in their greatness, were overwhelmed in a single day and night of calamity. The cities crumbled, the temples fell, and the ground beneath them gave way, pulling them all into the dark depths. The ocean closed over what remained, and the land that had once been filled with life, culture, and order became a sunken grave. All, the warriors, all the kings, and all the great houses of Atlantis were lost in an instant, and so too were the memories of many deeds, leaving only fragments carried in stories like this one. And the sea that covered them remained troubled, filled with thick silt and broken debris, turning away all who tried to cross. What had once been a thriving empire became nothing more than a tale, a warning left behind by time and tide, a vanished world that had once dreamed of ruling all others, now reduced to silence beneath the waves. And those who remembered told the story not to boast, but to teach, so that the same end would not befall others who might walk the path of arrogance, forgetting the quiet hand that once guided them from within. Concerning the allotments of the gods, it was told that in the beginning they divided the entire earth among themselves, some receiving greater portions and others smaller ones, and within their own lands they built sanctuaries, received offerings, and watched over their domains with care. Among them, one took the island of Atlantis as his share, and he settled there the children he had fathered with a mortal woman. In the region of the island where he made his home with them, there lay a vast and beautiful plain that stretched from the sea and reached through the center of the entire island. This plain was said to be the most beautiful and fertile of all, full of richness and life, and it was bordered near its heart by a low mountain that rose gently from the land, not high or steep, but standing in quiet dignity some 50 stades from the center. Upon this hill lived a native of the land, one of those sprung directly from the earth itself, along with his wife, and together they had a single daughter, the only child born to them. When the girl reached the age where marriage could be considered, fate took both of her parents from her, leaving her alone upon the hill. Then the god who had claimed the island for his own saw her and was struck with desire for her, and he took her as his wife. To protect her and their future together, he surrounded the hill with rings of land and sea, alternating in layers, shaping them with divine power into a pattern that no man could cross. There were 5 circles in all, 2 of land and 3 of water, crafted with perfect precision, each ring encircling the next, and all lying at equal distances from one another. At that time, men did not have ships, nor had they learned the ways of sailing, so the barriers he created could not be crossed by any mortal. He, being a god, easily arranged all things at the center of the island. From beneath the ground, he brought forth 2 springs, one of warm water and the other cold, and these flowed freely to nourish the land and those who lived upon it. From the earth he caused all manner of crops to grow in abundance, so that food was never scarce. And the central island became a place of wonder, lush and full of life. In time, he became the father of 5 pairs of twin sons, and he raised them with great care. When they were grown, he divided the entire island into 10 equal parts, and gave to each son a portion to rule. The firstborn of the eldest pair received the central dwelling of their mother and the land around it, which was the richest and best, and he was named king over all the others. The rest were made rulers of their own territories, each with many subjects and wide lands to govern. To them he gave names, and to the eldest he gave a name that would live on through the ages, for from him the island received its title, and the sea that surrounded it came to be called by his name. He was Atlas, the first king of Atlantis, the twin brother of Atlas, who ruled the region of the island that lay nearest to the famous straits, close to the place that would later be known as Gadara, was given the name Gaderos in the native tongue, though in Greek he was called Umelos. It is likely that from this name the land took its title, for it was not uncommon for places to be named after their early rulers. The next pair of sons were also given their portions of the land, and among them one was named Ampheres. So it continued, as each pair of twins received their share of the island, spreading out over the lands their father had shaped and enriched. The central part remained the heart of it all, ruled by the eldest, who held the authority above all others, but each brother ruled in his own domain, loyal to the one who wore the crown, and together they formed a mighty realm, born from the earth and the sea, shaped by divine will, and sustained by the bounty that flowed endlessly from the land the story told of these beginnings, of the plain that stretched like a green jewel in the center of the island, of the low mountain where the mother of kings once lived, and of the God who made all things grow, building belts of sea and land not just as defense, but as a sign of the order he imposed on the world. It was this structure, this balance between sea, land, and life, that allowed the island to flourish in the days that followed. Though their names would carry forward, and the sea itself would echo their legacy, the people and the land would one day vanish from sight, remembered only through stories passed down. But for a time, in the early age of the gods and their chosen lands, Atlantis stood strong, ruled by 10 brothers, born of a god and a mortal, encircled by waters that no man could cross, and blessed with riches that came not from conquest but from the gifts of the earth itself. And the other was named Uaimon, and from the third pair the elder received the name Mnesius, while the younger was called Autochthon. And of the fourth pair, the first was named Elasippos, and the second Mestor. And from the final pair, the elder bore the name Azais, while the younger was Diaprepes. These 10 sons, along with their descendants, continued to live on the island and ruled over it for many generations, maintaining order and leadership not only over the central island itself, but also over many surrounding islands scattered throughout the sea. And as mentioned before, they held dominion over distant coastal peoples, stretching from the regions of Egypt to the far reaches of Taurania. Their rule endured for ages, supported by a strong and unbroken line of succession, for from Atlas, the eldest, came a lineage that preserved the kingship by always passing it to the eldest son, and in this way the kingdom remained steady through time. Their greatness was not just in name or inheritance, but also in the unmatched wealth they held, a kind of wealth so vast and abundant that no royal family before them had known anything like it, nor was it likely that any future realm would easily see its equal. The richness of their lands and the prosperity of their cities meant they lacked for nothing. Their position at the head of their domain granted them a steady stream of goods brought in from other lands. But the island itself, in its natural bounty, offered nearly everything required for daily life. The soil held within it an array of metals, both those that were hard and durable, and those that could be melted and shaped, all drawn from the depths by skilled hands. Among these was a special metal, now spoken of only by name, but then far more than that, for the island contained many mines of it. This metal was orichalcum, a brilliant substance also called mountain copper, which at that time was the second most valued material in the world, surpassed only by gold. From the forests came an endless supply of wood, useful for carpenters and builders, strong timbers and fine planks used in the making of homes, ships, tools, and temples. As for animals, both wild and tame, the island had no shortage. Among the greatest of them was the elephant, which the land supported in large numbers, for there was more than enough food in the marshes, in the rivers, in the plains, and on the mountains, not only for smaller beasts, but even for the largest and hungriest of all. But it was not only materials and animals that the land provided. The island was full of fragrance and color, for the soil brought forth in abundance all the sweet-scented plants known to the earth, whether these grew from roots or sprouted from herbs, or rose tall as trees, or flowed as resin from flowers and fruits. There were oils and perfumes. There were gums and saps, all perfumed with nature's richness, and they spread their scent across the fields and gardens. There was also every kind of fruit, both the juicy kind that is eaten fresh and the dry kind that nourishes like grain, used in daily meals. All kinds of vegetables grew easily and were harvested in large amounts, and the trees offered both solid foods and those that could be pressed into oils or used as ointments, among them olives and other fruits useful for the table. Even those fruits which are harder to store, those grown more for joy and delight, like apples or pomegranates, were found across the land in beautiful groves, and the fruits brought out at the end of a feast, those rare kinds which bring balance to the overfilled stomach and offer relief to the body after indulgence, were all there in plenty, ripe and golden under the sun. All of this, every scent, every flavor, every shape and color of nature's gift, was produced in that sacred island, which at the time lay beneath a sky that smiled upon it, untouched by storm or ruin, blessed by the divine hands that shaped it and nurtured it. It was a place of perfection, rich in every resource, abundant in beauty and life, and through the generations the descendants of the 10 kings ruled in harmony over a land that gave more than it took. The waters were clear, the air was sweet, the hills rolled gently and the plains stretched far, and everywhere one looked, the works of nature and the works of hands lived in unity. The people built great cities and raised strong walls, and yet nature was never far, for gardens and groves wound through every space. The animals walked without fear, the crops grew without struggle, and the fruits of every season arrived in their turn, each more splendid than the last. And above it all stood the memory of the first king, whose name the island carried, and whose spirit was said to dwell still among the winds and waves, watching over a land once bright with gold and green, now silent beneath the sea. Endless abundance. And thus, receiving from the earth all these products, they furnished forth their temples and royal dwellings, their harbours and their docks, and all the rest of their country, ordering all in the fashion following. First of all, they constructed bridges over each of the circular belts of sea that surrounded the central city, so that there could be passage to and from the royal palace without obstruction. The palace itself had been built from the very beginning, located precisely at the place where the god had first united with the mortal woman and where the original settlement began. Each new king, inheriting the palace from his predecessor, added to it according to his own taste and ambition, always striving to make it more splendid, more intricate, more glorious than before, until at last it stood as a masterpiece of size and beauty, so remarkable that none could gaze upon it without wonder. To allow sea access to the city, they cut a great channel from the outer sea through to the outermost ring, a waterway that was 3 plethra wide, 100 feet deep, and extended for 50 stades. This channel created an entrance wide enough for the larger ships to pass, opening the city to the ocean like a grand harbour. Within the belt of land that separated each sea ring, they carved out narrow channels aligned with the bridges, connecting one circle of water to the next. These passages were just wide enough to fit a single trireme, and they were covered from above to form subterranean canals, as the raised lips of the land ring stood high enough to allow the roofing. The widest of the sea circles, the one farthest from the centre that was pierced by the ocean channel, was 3 stades across, and the adjoining land circle matched its width. Moving inward, the next set of water and land circles measured 2 stades each. The smallest and innermost sea ring, which encircled the royal island at the heart of it all, was a stade wide. The central island, where the palace stood, measured 5 stades across in diameter, making it the beating heart of the entire layout. Around the island and each of the concentric land and sea circles, they constructed a stone wall to enclose the whole, and this included the bridges themselves. At each end of the bridges, where they met the canals, stood great gates and watchtowers to guard the entrances and monitor passage. The stone used for all these constructions was quarried from beneath the central island, and from under both the outer and inner rings. These stones came in 3 natural colours, white, black, and red, and as they were extracted, they formed not just the structures, but also 2 deep inner docks, carved straight from the rock and roofed by the remaining natural surface above. Some buildings they made with solid colours, using a single kind of stone, while others were built with a mixture, arranging the different hues into beautiful patterns that added variety and charm to the overall appearance. They covered the entire outer wall, the one enclosing the outermost sea circle, with a coating of shining brass laid on like plaster so that it gleamed in the light. The wall of the second circle closer in was coated with tin, and the wall that encircled the very centre, the heart of the royal island, they overlaid with orichalcum, a metal then known for its dazzling beauty and rarity, said to shine like fire. Each level of the city shimmered in its own light, the materials glinting in different tones depending on where the sun fell or where the torches burned. The bridges were wide and solid, the towers tall and strong, the canals deep and straight, and the entire complex laid out in circles like a grand living diagram drawn by hands guided from above. The layout was both practical and beautiful, uniting form and function with a balance that pleased both the eye and the mind. The people moved easily across the bridges, ships floated calmly through the canals, and guards stood at their posts beneath arched gates that rose from stone and metal. Even from afar, the city looked like a crown upon the sea, its layers of land and water forming rings around a glowing jewel at the centre, where the palace rose high above gardens and fountains. The colours of the buildings reflected the colours of the stone from which they were built, and the blending of white, black, and red gave a sense of rhythm and artistry. Some walls were straight, others curved gently, all designed with care and finished with polish. The docks carved into the stone allowed the ships to anchor safely within the walls, and the sea routes within the city made trade and movement both easy and safe. The entire city pulsed with life, designed by minds who knew not only how to build, but how to live. Well within what they had built, every corner had a purpose, every line a reason, every color a meaning. The city was full and yet never crowded. It was organized and yet never rigid. Its shape followed the will of the land, and its heart beat with the pulse of the sea. From stone and metal, from sea and soil, they had made a city not just to live in, but to admire, to inherit, to pass down, and to remember. And it stood, glowing in the sun and lit by firelight at night, until the day came when it was swallowed by the sea, and its shining walls sank into silence. One they coated with tin, and that which encompassed the Acropolis itself with orichalcum, a metal known as mountain copper, which sparkled with a fiery glow unlike anything else, catching the sunlight and shining with a brilliance that made it appear as though flames danced along the surface. The royal palace, which stood proudly within the Acropolis, had been designed and built in a manner that reflected the divine origin of the kingdom. At its very center was a sacred temple, dedicated to the god and the mortal woman who had first given rise to the royal bloodline. This temple, set apart as holy ground, was encircled with a wall of pure gold, and it marked the very place where the first generation of rulers had been born. This place was held in the highest reverence, and each year representatives from all 10 parts of the island came bearing offerings during their season of sacrifice, honoring not only the god, but also the memory of the original kings who had once ruled from that sacred center. The temple of the god himself was a magnificent structure, measuring a full stade in length and 3 plethora in width, and its height was proportioned so perfectly that the entire building appeared harmonious and grand. Though majestic, it also carried a certain primitive or foreign quality in its design, which gave it a mysterious and powerful presence. The outside walls were entirely coated in shining silver, save for the pinnacles, which gleamed in gold. Inside, the roof appeared to be made entirely of ivory, but it was richly adorned with gold, silver, and orichalcum, blending the metals into a dazzling pattern that shimmered above the heads of all who entered. Every wall, pillar, and floor was covered in orichalcum, and the entire space glowed with the light reflected from these radiant surfaces. Within this temple stood many golden statues, the most dominant being the great image of the god himself. He was depicted standing in a grand chariot, driving 6 winged horses, and his figure was so tall that his head reached the roof itself. Surrounding him were 100 sea maidens riding on dolphins, the number believed to be exact according to the understanding of that time, and their figures added life and motion to the scene. The temple also contained countless other statues, many of which had been placed there by private individuals as offerings, each one carrying personal or communal meaning. Around the outside of the temple, in the open space that surrounded the building, stood golden statues of all the princes descended from the 10 kings, shone with their wives. These statues were also joined by numerous other votive images, not just from the rulers of the land, but also from private citizens and from people of other lands under their control, making the site both a center of power and a place of deep spiritual tribute. The altar of the temple matched the scale and craftsmanship of everything around it, built to complement the majesty of the temple and the palace, and it stood as a testament to the wealth and devotion of the people. The palace itself was equally grand, designed to reflect the greatness of the kingdom and the splendor of the temples. The city's springs were another marvel. There were 2 kinds, one flowing with cold water and the other with warm, and both were abundant, with a taste and clarity that made them prized resources. These springs were beautifully developed, surrounded by carefully designed buildings and plantations of trees that were suited to the nature of the waters. Around these springs, the people had constructed reservoirs, some open to the air and others covered, to provide for hot baths during the colder seasons. The bathing areas were thoughtfully separated, distinct baths for kings, others for common citizens, and still others for women. Even the horses and other beasts of burden had their own designated spaces for bathing, each arranged and equipped to meet its particular needs. The overflow from the springs was not wasted, but skillfully directed through channels to the sacred grove of the god, a lush and carefully tended area filled with trees of every kind, each growing tall and strong because of the richness of the soil and the constant flow of pure water. These trees rose to great heights and spread their branches wide, forming a natural canopy that offered both shade and beauty, and the entire grove stood as a living expression of the harmony between nature and design. The water, guided by the channels, moved through the grove in quiet streams and gentle flows, nourishing the land and giving life to the many plants and trees that filled the sacred space. The springs, the grove, the baths, the temple, and the palace were all parts of a unified whole, each element carefully arranged and crafted to support the others. Everything had a place and a purpose, and all of it spoke to the richness, care, and understanding with which the land had been shaped. The city was not merely a place of buildings and walls, but a living space, where nature and architecture worked together, where water flowed freely and light danced on metal and stone, where devotion to the divine shaped every act and every structure, and where the people, whether rulers or citizens, moved through a world that was beautiful not only because of what it contained, but because of how it had been brought into being, with order, with reverence, and with a deep and enduring sense of balance. Let the water to the outer circles over against the bridges, and there, where the land curved in wide rings, they had constructed many temples dedicated to the gods, and in addition to the temples, there were countless gardens that flourished with the abundance of the island's fertile soil. They also built exercising grounds in each of the circular belts of land, some areas set apart specifically for men and others for horses, each crafted with care to serve its purpose. At the very center of the largest island ring, they laid out a racecourse built for the training and contest of horses, a wide track that measured a stade across, and its length extended in a strip that followed the full circular path around the interior of the island. All around this course, positioned to either side, stood barracks that housed most of the spearmen, soldiers stationed to guard the city and maintain order. But closer still, within the smaller circle that lay nearer to the Acropolis, were guardhouses set aside for the more trusted soldiers, those whose loyalty had been proven and whose duty was to protect more sensitive areas. And closest of all, inside the Acropolis itself, the most loyal and dependable guards had their dwellings placed directly around the presence of the royal family, so that they might protect the rulers at all times and be ever watchful. Beyond the areas dedicated to living and guarding, the island's shipyards were full, lined with triremes of all sizes, ready for both trade and war. These ships, sleek and strong, were equipped with every tool and item necessary for sailing, and their rigging, oars, and tackle were all in perfect order, kept in constant readiness. The yards were active, busy with preparations and maintenance, for the sea was central to their power. Such was the condition and structure of the land immediately surrounding the residence of the kings. If one moved beyond this inner core and crossed over the 3 outer harbours, there stood another great wall. This wall began at the edge of the sea and wrapped in a perfect circle around the city, standing at a consistent distance of 50 stades from the outermost ring and harbour. The 2 ends of this wall met and joined together again at the seaward mouth of the channel, forming a complete enclosure. Along the entire length of this outer wall, houses had been built close together, forming a continuous band of habitation, and within this wall was the lifeblood of the city's trade and connection to the world. The great seaway and the largest of the harbours were constantly alive with movement, filled with ships arriving from every direction, bringing goods and people from near and far. Merchants crowded the docks, sailors unloaded goods, traders shouted prices, and buyers called out in return. The noise never ceased. By day or by night, there was always a clamour, a rising and falling din of voices, footsteps, water, ropes, and carts. A hum of activity that echoed through the walls of the harbour and gave the city its restless, vibrant spirit. Now, as for the city itself and the land around the ancient royal dwelling, the description had been almost fully recounted according to the records. What remained was to describe the rest of the island, its shape, its nature, and how it had been organized and maintained. According to the account, the island as a whole rose steeply from the sea, lifting its body out of the ocean with a great height, as if it had once been heaved upward by the hand of the earth itself. Yet the land around the central city, by contrast, was all a vast and level plain. This plain encircled the city in all directions and was itself embraced by towering mountains that reached all the way to the sea. The plain was remarkably flat, smooth across its whole surface, and shaped almost like a perfect rectangle. In size, it stretched 3,000 stades in length on each of its longer sides, and 2,000 stades in width at its center, measured from the shore inland. This expanse of land lay open to the south and was sheltered from the winds of the north, protected by the mountain ring that enclosed it like a natural wall. The mountains themselves were, at that time, counted among the greatest and most celebrated in the known world. They were said to surpass all others in number, in height, and in beauty, and they bore upon their slopes countless villages, rich and well populated with those who worked the land. Streams flowed from their sides, lakes lay nestled within their folds, and meadows spread out under their heights, providing pasture for every kind of animal, both wild and domesticated. These mountains were a source of endless nourishment for the island, supplying food and shelter for creatures of all kinds and offering abundant wood in all sizes and varieties. The timber cut from their forests was plentiful enough for every type of work, from the construction of homes to the building of ships, from the crafting of tools to the raising of temples. The forests supplied great beams for roofs, planks for flooring, curved wood for ships' hulls, and straight trunks for the tall masts of their vessels. The land was so rich that nothing was lacking, and the people had only to work in harmony with its bounty to receive everything they needed for life and trade and ceremony. This great plain, wrapped in mountain and washed by ocean, served as the heart of their civilization, ordered by law, maintained by labor, and blessed by nature with all that was needed for growth and greatness. As a result of natural forces, together with the labors of many kings which extended over many ages, the condition of the plain was this. It was originally a quadrangle, straight-sided for the most part, and stretched out in shape, and wherever it lacked exact rectangular form, they corrected it by digging a wide and deep trench all around its perimeter. As for the size of this trench, its depth, its breadth, and its length. The account given makes it sound almost unbelievable when one thinks of it being made by human hands, especially in addition to all the other construction and organization of the land. Still, the record insists upon it, and so it must be told. The trench was dug to a depth of 1 plethrum and kept at a steady width of 1 stade throughout, and because it encircled the entire plain, its length came out to a total of 10,000 stades. Into this trench flowed the waters of the streams that descended from the surrounding mountains, and after these waters travelled the long circle of the trench, they were directed toward the city on both sides and finally discharged into the sea nearby. On the side of the city that faced inland, they had also constructed channels running in straight lines across the plain. Each of these was about 100 feet wide, and they led from the plain into the great encircling trench. The distance between each of these channels was set at 100 stades, creating a grid that made the movement of water efficient and allowed it to flow where needed. These canals not only helped to irrigate the land, but also served as a means to bring materials from the mountains down to the city. The people transported timber and other goods from the forests in boats that moved along these channels. They had even cut passageways between one canal and another, as well as to the city itself, to allow smooth travel by water for goods and supplies. The land was worked with great care and expertise, and they harvested it twice each year. In the winter, they relied on the rains from the sky, which filled the trenches and channels. In the summer, they made use of the water that came from underground, directing it from the surrounding earth through the channels and onto the fields. In this way, the land remained fertile, and the crops grew in abundance, with the soil never left dry or fallow. The system of irrigation and agriculture was precise, deliberate, and sustained by both natural forces and human effort, and so the fields remained rich season after season. Regarding the organization of manpower, there was a specific system in place. It was decided that each allotment of land would provide 1 man to lead the able-bodied fighters living on that portion of the plain. Each of these allotments measured 10 stades by 10 stades, forming a square. The total number of allotments across the entire plain was recorded to be 60,000, and thus there were 60,000 leaders, each responsible for 1 group of fighting men. In addition to the men on the plain, there were even more people living in the mountains and scattered throughout the rest of the island. Their numbers were so great that they were said to be countless, and they too were organized into local districts and villages, each assigned under the same military structure and led by their appointed chiefs. As part of the defense arrangements, each leader was required to contribute 1/6 of the equipment needed for a full war chariot, so that altogether there would be 10,000 chariots fully supplied and ready for battle. In addition to the chariots, each unit was also expected to provide 2 horses with mounted riders, and then another pair of horses without a chariot, guided by a warrior equipped with a small shield and accompanied by a rider trained to leap between horses as needed during combat. Furthermore, each group was responsible for sending 2 hoplites, heavy armed infantry soldiers trained for frontline fighting. There were also 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 more slingers equipped for lighter movement, and 3 javelin throwers, all selected to provide a balanced force of long-range and close-range attackers. Lastly, each allotment was to provide 4 sailors, who would be assigned to the crews of a fleet, totaling 1,200 ships. This was the military arrangement for the royal city, which stood as the center of power and command. The remaining 9 cities of the kingdom had similar military systems, though their structures varied slightly, with different configurations depending on the needs and characteristics of each region. describing all those would take much more time, for each had its own methods and patterns, but all followed the larger principles laid down by the central authority. This organized and well-maintained military ensured that the kingdom was ready at all times, both for defense and for any action required beyond their shores. From the rich land that was shaped by earth and stream, to the channels that carried timber and harvest, to the warriors who stood ready by land and sea. Everything in the great plain of the island had been arranged with order, effort, and the long vision of those who ruled across generations, binding the strength of the land with the will of its people. And posts of honor the disposition, ever since the beginning, was this: each of the 10 kings ruled over the people and most of the laws within his own portion of land and throughout his own city, and each held the power to judge and punish, even to the point of death, anyone he deemed deserving within his territory. But while each ruler had authority over his own domain, the way they interacted with one another and the unity among them was guided by the commands of the god, passed down through law and preserved in the records left by the first kings. These laws had been carefully inscribed on a great pillar made of shining orichalcum, a metal that gleamed like fire, and this pillar stood within the central temple of the god on the island, a sacred place where all matters of judgment and counsel were brought. There the 10 kings would gather, not every year, but every 5th year, and then every 6th year after that, alternating the interval to show equal honor to the even and the odd, a balance they believed held deep meaning. When they assembled, they came together in solemn ritual, not just to speak of politics and governance, but to reaffirm their bond and to hold each other accountable under the sacred law. First, they gave pledges to one another, and this part of the gathering followed a ritual unlike any other. Within the sacred precincts of the god's temple, bulls roamed freely, untouched and unmarked. The 10 kings, gathering alone, without the presence of weapons or iron tools, offered their prayers to the god, asking to be guided in their hunt for a worthy sacrifice. Then, using only staves and nooses, they chased the bulls, and whichever one they were able to capture was led with respect to the foot of the pillar. There, over the top of the orichalcum column, where the laws were inscribed, they cut the bull's throat, letting its blood fall upon the sacred text, sealing the moment with sacrifice and binding their gathering with the life offered. Alongside the laws, the pillar also bore an oath, one written with the power to curse those who would break it, a stern warning and a divine protection woven together in one surface. Once the bull had been sacrificed, they prepared the limbs according to custom, consecrating them, and mixing a bowl of wine into which they poured a small amount of the bull's blood for each of the kings. The rest of the remains were carried to the sacred fire after they had cleaned and purified the space around the pillar. Then, with golden ladles, each king drew wine from the bowl, made a libation over the fire, and took an oath. In this oath, they swore to judge rightly, and only according to the laws inscribed on the pillar. They promised that if any among them had done wrong in the past, they would hold them accountable, and they also swore that from that day forward, they would never knowingly break any part of the law, nor would they ever rule or be ruled by any decree that stood outside the commands of the god and the legacy left by their ancestors. Each one, after speaking the vow, drank from the cup and gave the rest as an offering in the temple, sealing the promise both for themselves and for their descendants, ensuring that their line would remain bound by the same law through time. After these solemn acts, they shared a simple meal and completed any other necessary matters of state. But when the day faded and darkness came, and the flames of the sacrifice burned down into quiet cinders, the 10 kings changed into robes of deep black, the most beautiful garments woven for such an occasion, and they sat together upon the ground around the dying embers of the offering. They extinguished every light and fire that remained in the sanctuary, surrounding themselves only with darkness, and in that silence and shadow they held their court. If any among them had accused another of violating the law or of acting wrongly, it was then that such charges were heard. In this circle of equals, no voice rose above another, and each ruler was subject to the same judgment as he might pronounce. They listened, they questioned, they weighed the truth of the matter, and gave their verdicts not in haste or pride, but in the presence of the gods and before the words of the law. When at last morning came and light returned to the land, the judgments they had reached were recorded on golden tablets, preserving not just the decision but the process, the ritual, and the unity of the kings who ruled as one body, though from 10 separate thrones. These tablets were not cast aside but kept with care, stored in the temple as a record of justice, of law, and of loyalty, a testimony to the covenant between ruler and law, between man and God, between the past and the future, written not just in gold but in the shared will of those who understood that strength without law was ruin, and power without unity would fall, dedicated them together with their robes as memorials. And there were many other special laws concerning the peculiar rights and responsibilities of the several princes, and of these the most important were clear and binding. First and foremost was the law that none of them should ever bear arms against one another, under any condition, for unity among them was sacred and must never be broken. And if ever, in any city under their rule, someone should rise to overthrow the established royal line, all the princes were bound to come together and provide aid, joining their forces and their counsel just as their ancestors had done in former times. They would deliberate together on how best to deal with such threats, whether by war or by other means, but they would always do so in unison. And in these councils, the right of leadership and final decision would be granted to the royal house that descended from the first king, who had been given the name of Atlas. Even within their shared power, there were limits to individual rule, for no single king had the right to put any of his fellow princes to death unless he first obtained the agreement of more than half of the 10. These laws had been laid down in the earliest times and passed from one generation to the next without question, and so they preserved both order and respect among the rulers of the land. Such was the scale and nature of the power that held sway in those regions during that long-forgotten age, and it was this very power that, according to the ancient story, the god marshaled and turned against the lands beyond, setting it in motion under a pretext that seemed just and fitting. For many generations, as long as the divine element that had been placed in them remained strong and bright, the people of the island lived in accordance with the law, holding closely to the sacred principles and maintaining a gentle and noble nature. Their thoughts and intentions were true, their dealings fair and kind, and they treated all changes in life with balance and wisdom, neither falling into despair nor rising into arrogance. They honored their divine origin and acted with humility even as they prospered, never letting their growing wealth corrupt their character. They did not crave material things above all else, nor did they allow their treasures to rule their hearts, but instead held fast to virtue, which they knew was greater than gold. In this way, even though they possessed riches in great abundance, gold and silver, fertile lands, vast cities, and splendid temples, they bore these blessings with grace, recognizing that true greatness lay in the harmony between virtue and unity. Their wisdom had shown them that the more they pursued goodness and lived in mutual respect, the more their riches grew and flourished. But if ever they were to lose this balance, both the wealth and the virtue would fade together. And so, their divine nature kept them strong, and their cities and fields were filled with wonders, and their names were spoken with admiration far beyond their shores. But over time, as happens with all that is part mortal, the divine part in them began to fade. Little by little, generation by generation, the pure light within them grew dim, as it mixed too often with the mortal strain, and the human traits began to dominate. And with this shift came a change in their spirit. No longer could they carry the weight of their power. With the same balance and wisdom, and the grace that once made them shine gave way to something heavier and less beautiful. They had not grown in evil all at once, but gradually, as their thoughts turned more toward ambition and their desires began to exceed their needs. In their eyes, they still believed themselves blessed and powerful, and to those who could not see with deeper vision, they indeed appeared to be even more glorious than before. Their palaces still gleamed, their temples still rose into the sky, and their ships still crossed the sea in numbers. But to one who had the gift of perceiving what makes a life truly good, they had become unbalanced, corrupted not by external forces, but by the rising of ambition, unchecked by reverence. What had once been greatness joined with humility had now become greatness. Bloated by pride, they no longer honored the harmony of law and spirit that had given them their strength. They had lost the fairest part of themselves, and though their hands still held gold, their souls had grown poor. And it was then that the God who watches over all, the one who reigns by law and perceives the hidden truth of things, looked upon them and saw their decline. This God, ruler over all gods, saw that a people once noble and ordered, once filled with clarity and purpose, had fallen into disorder and falsehood, and he, who gives justice and maintains balance, resolved to act, to bring correction upon those who had turned from the path set for them. The story tells that he gathered all the gods into their highest dwelling, and there, from the center of the universe, he prepared to deliver judgment, not out of wrath, but out of the need to restore what had been lost, to remind those who had forgotten, and to return the world to the order that had once made it whole. Punishment upon them, to the end that when chastised they might strike a truer note. Wherefore he assembled together all the gods into that abode which they honor most, standing as it does at the center of all the universe, a place from which they could behold all that comes into being, all that grows and perishes, and every deed done under heaven. And having gathered them in that sacred place, he prepared to speak, but the ancient text breaks off at this very moment, leaving only silence in place of the words that were to follow. What the God said and what judgment he pronounced remains unknown, for no writing preserves it, and the voice of that decision was lost to time. Yet the silence itself, wrapped in the mystery of what could have been said, speaks of a reckoning so vast that it left no need for further record. In later ages, a man known for wisdom and law, one who had traveled far from his own land to seek knowledge, came to Egypt and spoke with priests of great learning. This man, remembered for his reforms and remembered also by the name Solon, studied under those who guarded the ancient memories, priests of Heliopolis and Sais, men named in records as keepers of long histories. From them, as was told by later thinkers, he heard the account of the lost land, the vanished island, the tale of Atlantis. He tried, it is said, to shape this account into a poetic form, to bring it into the language and rhythm of his people, so that it might live again, not only in history, but in art. Though he did not complete that vision, his telling passed into the mind of a later thinker. That thinker, born with a gift for weaving truth and myth into wisdom, took the tale and sought to craft it anew. He imagined it as an open land, a story untouched by other hands, a field awaiting cultivation, one that belonged to him in spirit because of his kinship with the earlier lawgiver. He began to build, laying out vast spaces for thought, porches, enclosures, and grand courtyards of meaning, more expansive than any previous tale or poem had ever dared. But time, as it does, claimed him before the work could be finished. What remains is a beginning rich with promise, a fragment of a vision, a temple of words whose walls were never fully raised. Because of this, the beauty of what was written brings with it a deeper sadness for what was left unwritten. Just as the great Olympieion in Athens stands partly built, a reminder of what could have been. The tale of Atlantis in the hands of this thinker remains among his most profound beginnings, unfinished yet unforgettable. Beyond this telling, other ancient writers also spoke of Atlantis, or those called Atlanteans. These accounts did not always describe the island in the sea, but often spoke of peoples who lived near the Atlas Mountains, in the lands we now call Northwest Africa. These tribes and colonies, some of them Phoenician in origin, were known to the Greeks and Romans, and their territory was sometimes spoken of as if it were itself an island, large and rich and touched by the sea. One such writer, a historian who gathered the myths and stories of many peoples, gave an account of the Atlanteans in his history. He spoke of them in relation to their war with a race of warrior women, and in that telling, he found reason to recount their beliefs. According to their own myths, these people, who lived near the great ocean and dwelled in a land of fertility and bounty, were said to surpass all others in their reverence for the gods. They were gentle in their dealings with strangers and believed that the gods themselves had been born among them. Their stories, it was said, did not differ much from those of the Greeks, and in fact, they pointed to lines from the most famous of poets, where the goddess speaks of visiting the ends of the earth, the home of Okeanos, father of the gods, and Tethys, their divine mother. In this myth, the first of their kings was named Ouranos, or heaven, and he stood at the beginning of all their tales. The line that followed was broken, but what remains shows that the Atlanteans believed in a divine origin, in a time when earth and sky, water and flame were not yet separated, and the beings that shaped the world still walked among mortals. The telling fades again, lost in time and silence, but its echoes remain, passed from one hand to another, remembered in fragments, spoken in whispers, and written down in parts. These stories, drawn from temples, from scrolls, from travelers and poets, each add a piece to the whole. Yet the full shape of Atlantis, the voice of the god who called the judgment, and the fate of those who forgot their law, all of it lies just beyond the reach of certainty, a shadow upon the water, a city remembered not for what it is, but for how it was lost. He gathered the human beings who dwelt in scattered habitations within the shelter of a walled city, and caused his subjects to cease from their lawless ways and their bestial manner of living, discovering for them the uses of cultivated fruits, how to store them up, and not a few other things which are of benefit to man. And he also subdued the larger part of the inhabited earth, in particular the regions to the west and the north. And since he was a careful observer of the stars, he foretold many things which would take place throughout the world, and for the common people, He introduced the year on the basis of the movement of the sun and the months on that of the moon, and instructed them in the seasons which recur year after year. Consequently, the masses of the people, being ignorant of the eternal arrangement of the stars and marveling at the events which were taking place as he had predicted, conceived that the man who taught such things partook of the nature of the gods, and after he had passed from among men, they accorded to him immortal honors, both because of his benefactions and because of his knowledge of the stars. And then they transferred his name to the firmament of heaven, both because they thought that he had been so intimately acquainted with the risings and the settings of the stars and with whatever else took place in the firmament, and because they would surpass his benefactions by the magnitude of the honors which they would show him, in that for all subsequent time they proclaimed him to be the king of the universe. To Ouranos, the myth continues, were born 45 sons from a number of wives, and of these 18, it is said, were by Titaia, each of them bearing a distinct name, but all of them as a group were called after their mother Titans. Titaia, because she was prudent and had brought about many good deeds for the peoples, was deified after her death by those whom she had helped, and her name was changed to Gi, which is to say, Earth. To Ouranos were also born daughters, the two eldest of whom were by far the most renowned above the others, and were called Basilia and Rhea, whom some also named Pandora. Of these daughters, Basilia, who was the eldest and far excelled the others in both prudence and understanding, reared all her brothers, showing them collectively a mother's kindness. Consequently, she was given the appellation of Great Mother, and after her father had been translated from among men into the circle of the gods, with the approval of the masses and her brothers, she succeeded to the royal dignity, though she was still a maiden, and because of her exceedingly great chastity, had been unwilling to unite in marriage with any man. But later, because of her desire to leave sons who should succeed to the throne, she united in marriage with one of her brothers, and to him she bore 2 children, a son and a daughter, and the son, who was loved by all, showed great promise from his youth. The mother delighted in him and set her hopes in him to carry on the line of kingship and preserve order. But in time, through envy and rivalry, some of her brothers who had once lived peacefully under her care conspired together in secret, fearing the rising favor shown to her son and the love the people bore him. And so, in the shadow of her trust and without warning, they fell upon the boy and his sister and slew them both. The land was thrown into grief, and Basilia, overwhelmed by sorrow, wandered about calling upon the gods and seeking justice for the children she had lost. In her grief, she was said to have lost her mind, crying out in pain through the fields and mountains, until at last she vanished, and none knew what became of her. But the people, struck by the tragedy and moved by her suffering, remembered her not only as their queen, but as a divine mother whose love had once embraced even those who betrayed her. They built shrines in her honor and gave her a place among the gods, and her name, along with her children's, was whispered in prayers and remembered in sacred rites, a symbol of loss, devotion, and the fragile thread that binds power to love. In this way, the tale of the heavens and the earth, of kings who gazed upon the stars and daughters who became mothers of nations, was passed down, woven into the stories of those who came after, who looked up at the stars and remembered that even the highest must sometimes fall, and that wisdom, though it may rule for a time, must be guarded with care, for even the greatest light can be eclipsed. Marriage with Hyperion, one of her brothers, for whom she had the greatest affection, And when there were born to her 2 children, Helios and Selene, who were admired by all for the beauty and purity of their forms and spirits, her joy was full, and the people looked upon the family with reverence. But the happiness of their house stirred envy in the hearts of her other brothers, who grew fearful that Hyperion, by virtue of his union with their sister and the favour shown to his children, might take hold of the royal power and turn it to himself. Moved by jealousy and suspicion, they plotted among themselves and, driven by ambition, committed an act of deep wickedness. They rose against Hyperion and slew him with the sword, and then they took the boy Helios, still only a child, and cast him into the river Eridanos, where he drowned beneath the waters. When this evil deed came to be known, the sorrow that followed was like a dark cloud over the land. Selene, the sister, who loved her brother with all her heart, could not endure the weight of her grief. In despair, she climbed to the roof and threw herself down, ending her life in sorrow for the brother she could not save. As for the mother Basilia, she wandered along the banks of the river, searching for the body of her son. She walked for days, calling his name, but her strength failed her, and she collapsed in exhaustion and sorrow. In her weakness, she slipped into a swoon, and there, in her silence, she saw a vision. In her dream, Helios stood before her, no longer a child, but radiant and calm, and he spoke gently to her, telling her not to grieve. He told her that justice would come, that the Titans who had committed this cruel act would face punishment for their betrayal, and that he and his sister, though gone from the world, would not be forgotten. He said that the divine power would transform them into immortal natures, that the sacred fire men had long spoken of in the heavens would henceforth be named Helios, the sun, and that his sister, once known by another name, would forever be called Selene, the moon. When the mother awoke from this vision, she rose and went before the people. She told them all that she had seen, and of the wrongs that had been done to her family. She asked the people to give honours to her children as they would to the gods, and she said that no man should touch her again. But after this, grief took hold of her mind. She gathered the playthings that had once belonged to her daughter, those that made sound when shaken, and she wandered the land in wild sorrow, her hair unbound, her eyes wide with the madness of loss. She moved like one possessed, the noise of the cymbals and drums echoing through the air as she passed, and all who saw her were struck with wonder and sorrow. People came near her, some out of compassion, some out of fear, and many clung to her, trying to bring her peace. But then there came a storm, fierce and sudden. The sky darkened and thunder rolled across the heavens. Lightning flashed again and again, and in the midst of that great storm Basilia vanished from sight. No one saw where she went, and though they searched, she was never found again. In their amazement and reverence, the people believed that she had been taken up by the gods, and they began to honour her as divine. They named her among the goddesses, and to remember her sorrow and her loss, they built altars in her name. In their rituals, they imitated the moments of her final days, pounding kettle drums and clashing cymbals, keeping alive the memory of her grief and the love she bore her children. To the stars above, they gave the names Helios and Selene, so that every day and every night the sun and the moon would remind them of the boy and girl who had been taken from them, and of the mother who had lost them both. And so her story was carried forward through the ages, not only as a tale of sorrow, but as a lesson in love, betrayal, and divine transformation. After the fall of Hyperion, the tale continues. The kingdom that had once been unified was divided among the sons of the first sky ruler. The most renowned of these heirs were Atlas and Kronos, brothers who each received a portion of the earth to rule. To Atlas, it is said, fell a great land, rich in mountains and strength, a region that carried his name thereafter, while Kronos was given another realm, where he too began to build his rule. These names, like those of the stars and the storm, lived on not just in stone or memory, but in the stories told when the night was deep and the fire was low, when the old tales came again, and the faces of gods and mortals flickered in the light like ghosts of a world that once was, a world of titans and sacrifice, of honor and betrayal, of light that rose and fell and rose again. The regions on the coast of Okeanos, and he not only gave the name of Atlantioi to his peoples, but likewise called the greatest mountain in the land Atlas. They say he was a man of vast knowledge and deep reflection, and he perfected the study of the stars and the skies, and was the first to explain to the world the concept of the celestial sphere. Because of this knowledge, it was believed in later times that the entire heavens rested upon his shoulders, not because he bore them in strength alone, but because he had first described the roundness and movement of the heavens in such a way that the myth itself preserved this wisdom, veiled in the image of burden and endurance. Many sons were born to him, but among them there was one who shone brighter than the rest in goodness, in justice, and in love for all people. His name was Hesperos, and he earned the trust and admiration of all who lived under his rule. It is said that he once climbed to the highest point of Mount Atlas, drawn upwards by his desire to understand the stars more deeply, and while he was there, searching the heavens with the calm of a wise heart, he was suddenly swept away by a great wind, and from that moment he was never seen again. The people mourned his disappearance and remembered his virtues, and in time they gave his name to the brightest star of the evening sky, believing that he had been placed there by divine kindness, to live forever above them as a light of hope and wisdom. Atlas, whose name lived on in land and legend, also had 7 daughters, and together they were called the Atlantides, though each had her own name: Maya, Electra, Taigete, Sterope, Merope, Alcyone, and Celaeno. They were spoken of as one, united in the beauty and dignity they carried. These daughters, full of grace and known for their purity, became closely joined to gods and heroes, and through them the blood of immortals entered the lineages of mortals. Maya, the eldest, lay with the king of the heavens, and bore a son who would one day guide souls, protect travelers, and bring the gifts of speech and invention to humankind. The other daughters too became mothers of children who would build cities, lead peoples, and do deeds remembered long after their time. Through the Atlantids, many lines of the earliest great heroes were formed, and so both Greeks and others who came before and after looked to them as the root of greatness. These daughters, after death, were remembered with reverence not only because of the children they bore, but also for their own lives, marked by modesty and strength. The people looked up to the sky and found them among the stars, placed there by memory and honor, and called them the Pleiades, a name that carried the weight of stories and the light of the night sky. The people of their land also called them nymphs, for it was the custom of the region to refer to their women with this gentle and respectful title, seeing in them the power of nature and the spirit of life. Meanwhile, the tale tells of the brother of Atlas, a man whose name echoed loudly through the generations for different reasons. His name was Kronos, and he was not remembered for kindness, but for harshness, for greed, and for deeds that turned brother against brother. He took as his wife his sister Rhea, and from this union came the one would one day be known across all lands and skies, for to them was born a son who did not follow the ways of his father. This son, whom people came to call Olympian, chose instead the path of fairness, of protection, and of calm strength. He lived not with cruelty, but with justice, and he welcomed those who came near him with peace. Because of this, people began to call him Father, a name not of power alone, but of care and support. As for how he rose to rule, the stories vary. Some say that his father, seeing his son's greater worth, stepped aside and gave him the throne by choice. Others say the son took it by force, ending a rule that had brought fear and restoring balance to a world that had begun to bend under the weight of its ruler's will. In either case, the change came, and with it a new age began, where the heavens were ruled by one who saw far and judged wisely. And so, from Atlas and Kronos, from daughters placed among stars and sons taken by the wind, the line of gods and heroes spread across the world. Their names were spoken by the sea and carved into stone. They were written in the movement of the stars and sung in the turning of the seasons. What began on the edge of Okeanos moved through time, through city and story, and remained not only in myth, but in every gaze lifted toward the sky in wonder. He was chosen as king by the masses because of the hatred they bore towards his father, and that when Kronos made war against him with the aid of the Titans, Zeus overcame him in battle, and on gaining supreme power visited all the inhabited world, conferring benefactions upon the race of men. He was preeminent also in bodily strength and in all the other qualities of virtue, and for this reason he quickly became master of the entire world, and in general he showed all zeal to punish impious and wicked men, and to show kindness to the masses. In return for all this, after he had passed from among men, he was given the name of Zen, because he was the cause of right living among men, and those who had received his favors showed him honor by enthroning him in the heavens, all men eagerly acclaiming him as God and Lord forever of the whole universe. These, then, are in summary the facts regarding the teachings of the Atlanteans about the gods. In those distant days, not all lands followed the same customs or kept the same order, for it is told that there existed, in the far west of Libya, at the very edge of the known world, a race of people ruled by women, who lived in a manner quite unlike that of others. Among these women, it was the custom to train in the arts of war, and they were required to serve in battle for a certain length of time, during which they preserved their virginity and lived not in the ways of softness, but in strength and discipline. These warrior women, known in later ages as Amazons, made their home on an island far to the west, a place called Hespera, named for its location in the evening lands. This island lay in the marsh known as Tritonis, near the great world-encircling ocean and close to the lands of Ethiopia. There, beside the mighty waters, stood a high mountain, rising sharply from the shore and touching the sky. A mountain the Greeks later called Atlas. The island itself was vast and filled with trees that bore every kind of fruit, providing food in abundance to those who dwelled there, and the land was rich with all things needed to sustain life. The Amazons, being brave and skilled in battle, brought the whole island under their rule, sparing only a single city called Mene, which was held sacred. This city, inhabited by Ethiopian fish-eaters, was known for its holy nature, for it was subject to eruptions of fire and was filled with a great variety of precious stones, bright red anthrax, glowing sardian, and the deep green smaragdos. After securing the island, the Amazons expanded their power, defeating many nearby Libyan tribes and nomads, and building within the marsh of Tritonis a vast city. This city, shaped like a peninsula, they named Kerenesos, a name that matched its form. From this stronghold, the Amazons continued their campaigns, driven by their unmatched courage and their love of glory. Their deeds, long remembered in myth and song, stretched far beyond the borders of their home, for they did not remain in their own land, but marched into other territories, claiming victories and spreading fear among those who stood against them. Their strength, their order, and their unmatched unity in battle made them feared and honored throughout the lands that touched ocean's edge. So the tale moves forward, from gods who fought for justice to women who ruled in strength, from islands lit by the fire of the sky to mountains that held the stars. And through these stories, the memory of those ages remained, shaped not only by what was believed, but by the awe that those ancient deeds inspired in the hearts of all who heard them. The account continues. The Amazones embarked upon great ventures, a longing having come over them to invade many parts of the inhabited world. The first people against whom they advanced, according to the tale, was the Atlantioi, the most civilized men among the inhabitants of those regions, who dwelt in a prosperous country and possessed great cities. It was among them, we are told, that mythology places the birth of the gods, in the regions which lie along the shore of Okeanos, in this respect agreeing with those among the Greeks who relate legends, and about this we shall speak in detail a little later. Now the queen of the Amazones, Myrina, collected, it is said, an army of 30,000 foot soldiers and 3,000 cavalry, since they favoured to an unusual degree the use of cavalry in their wars. For protective devices, they used the skins of large snakes, since Libya contains such animals of incredible size, and for offensive weapons, swords and lances. They also used bows and arrows, with which they struck not only when facing the enemy, but also when in flight, by shooting backwards at their pursuers with good effect. Upon entering the land of the Atlantioi, they defeated in a pitched battle the inhabitants of the city of Cern, as it is called, and making their way inside the walls along with the fleeing enemy, they got the city into their hands, and desiring to strike terror into the neighbouring peoples, they treated the captives savagely, put to the sword the men from the youth upward, led into slavery the children and women, and razed the city. But when the terrible fate of the inhabitants of Cern became known among their fellow tribesmen, it is related that the Atlantioi, struck with terror, surrendered their cities on terms of capitulation, and announced that they would do whatever should be commanded them, and that the Queen Myrina, bearing herself honourably towards the Atlantioi, both established friendship with them and founded a city to bear her name in place of the city which had been razed, and in it she settled both the captives and any native who so desired. Whereupon the Atlantioi presented her with magnificent presents, and by public decree voted to her notable honours, and she in return accepted their courtesy, and in addition promised that she would show kindness to their nation. And since the natives were often being warred upon by the Gorgones, as they were named, a folk which resided upon their borders, and in general had that people lying in wait to injure them, Myrina, they say, was asked by the Atlantioi to invade the land of the aforementioned Gorgon. But when the Gorgons drew up their forces to resist them, a mighty battle took place in which the Amazones, gaining the upper hand, slew great numbers of their opponents and took no fewer than 3,000 prisoners. And since the rest had fled, the land lay open before them. Yet Myrina, not being one to act in cruelty without cause, treated the captured Gorgones with unexpected mercy, sparing their lives and using them in service rather than ending them in vengeance. She established order in the newly subdued region and returned the borderlands to the Atlantioi under the terms of a lasting alliance, thus strengthening peace and trade across those territories. Her name became known not only for war and conquest, but also for wisdom in leadership and restraint in victory, and the people honored her not just as a warrior, but as a builder of cities and a bringer of peace. Her campaigns did not end there, for the stories go on to speak of further expeditions, each carried out with precision and boldness, yet always with a mind toward balance and justice, marking her reign as one remembered in both awe and admiration for many generations thereafter. For refuge into a certain wooded region, Marina undertook to set fire to the timber, being eager to destroy the race utterly. But when she found that she was unable to succeed in her attempt, she retired to the borders of her country. The great battle had ended, but the legend of this fierce struggle remains strong in memory, passing down through the generations as a story of bravery and power. Over time, the tale began to speak also of strange changes in the land itself, for it was said that long after Marina and her warriors had returned home, the marsh Tritones, the vast and watery place near the ocean, suddenly vanished from sight. One day, as people watched, a powerful earthquake tore apart the marsh, splitting open the ground until the waters disappeared into darkness. The parts of the marsh closest to the ocean fell away completely, leaving behind only emptiness, where once there had been rich water, reeds, and life. This disappearance shocked everyone who knew the land, for such a place could not easily vanish without a trace. Yet that is exactly what the ancient stories say happened, a mystery that puzzled people and filled them with wonder. After this event, the accounts of what had happened in those lands began to blend with other tales, connecting the bravery of Marina and her warriors with different legends of heroes and monsters. People mixed these stories together because they wanted to understand the past, and sometimes they added or changed parts to make the stories more exciting or meaningful. Over many years, the tale of the warrior women became part of a larger collection of myths. Some stories talked about creatures called gorgones, beings that frightened all who met them, and heroes like Perseus, who traveled far and fought bravely against such dangers. Others spoke of mighty heroes who journeyed to distant lands in search of special treasures or powerful secrets. These heroes, including Heracles, were also mentioned alongside the Amazones, making the stories richer and more complicated. The name Atlantioi itself became linked not only to these brave warriors and their powerful kingdom, but also to other people who lived around a famous mountain known as Atlas. These people might have been natives who lived in that area from very early times, or perhaps they were travelers who settled there later. Some stories even suggested they were connected with sailors from distant lands who had set up cities along the shore. This mix of stories created confusion, but also gave the legend strength, making people curious and wanting to know more. As time went on, other writers also began to speak of these legends. Some told of strange customs among those who lived on the edge of the ocean, saying their rulers wore special crowns made from the horns of a fish called the ramfish. These crowns were symbols of their royal authority, worn proudly by kings and queens alike. Others talked about another island that lay beyond the great mountain Atlas, out in the deep ocean itself. This mysterious island, also called Atlantis, was said to be a place far away, reachable only by sailing for 2 whole days along the African coast. It was near a desert region that stretched wide and empty, close to a point of land known as the Horn of the West. This place marked the beginning of a long coastline, curving towards the vast ocean, a distant edge of the world where few ever traveled. These many tales, written down by different people, gradually created a web of legends about Atlantis and the powerful kingdom that once stood proudly near the ocean. Yet some ancient historians warned that not all these stories could be trusted. They said some writers told stories simply to entertain, creating exciting adventures from their imaginations rather than from facts. Others might have believed reports that were false or exaggerated, passing along incorrect information without knowing it. Because of this, it became difficult for later people to know exactly what to believe. Despite the confusion, many believed there had truly been a powerful nation, known as Atlantis. The idea of its sudden disappearance under the sea remained fascinating, and the stories of brave warriors fighting great battles continued to inspire listeners. People never grew tired of imagining these strong women, armed with bows and swords, fighting bravely and fiercely against powerful foes. They admired how Marina had led her army into distant lands, battling against mighty opponents, capturing cities, and forging alliances. And they wondered about the lost marsh Tritonis, imagining how such a huge place filled with life could vanish into the earth. These stories spread far and wide, told around fires, repeated by travelers, and eventually written down to, become part of human memory. And though people understood that some parts of the tale were likely not true, they still found value in telling them. For these myths helped explain how different peoples lived, how they fought and worked together, and how they saw the world around them. They showed how bravery, honor, and courage were remembered and celebrated long after those who had displayed them were gone. So even today, the legends of Atlantis and the warrior women remain part of our shared story, reminding us of the power of courage and the wonder of places lost to history.